讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅第15節。呢節嘅名叫做 Wherein it is told and known to the knight of Ramirez and his squire were。咁上一回咧就講到發現咗森林嘅騎士同埋佢嘅侍從黑言，就係 Samson Carrasco 同埋 Tom Cecial。呢兩個人都係主人翁，佢哋識得嘅。Tom Cecial 就係 Sancho 嘅鄰居啦，係村入面嘅鄰居啦。而呢個 Samson Carrasco 咧，先前冇耐先至嚟探訪佢哋，以一個學者嘅身份同我哋講，城入面將 Don Quixote 嘅事蹟咧已經出版成書啦，作為一個傳話者啦，一個擁躉啊。但係呢一刻咧，赫然發現佢竟然係利用 Don Quixote 嘅身份做一啲招搖撞騙嘅事，而且仲要有似冇咁樣咧向 Don Quixote 咧作出挑撥。呢一刻咧，佢就俾 Don Quixote 打暈咗。咁我哋睇下故事發展落去咧 ，Samson 會唔會醒翻同 Don Quixote 咧有所對話啦
？Don Quixote went off satisfied, elated, and vainglorious in the highest degree, and having won a victory over such a valiant knight as he fancied him of the Ramirez to be, and one from whose knightly word he expected to learn whether the enchantment of his lady still continued, inasmuch as the said vanquished knight was bound, under the penalty of ceasing to be won, to return and render him an account of what took place between him and her. But Don Quixote was of one mind, he of the Ramirez of another, for he just then had no thought of anything but finding some village where he could plaster himself, as has been said already. The history goes on to say, then, that when the bachelor Samson Carrasco recommended Don Quixote to resume his knight-errantry which he had laid aside, it was in consequence of having been previously in conclave with the curate and the barber on the means to be adopted to induce Don Quixote to stay at home in peace and quiet without wearying himself with his ill-starred adventures. At which consultation it was decided by the unanimous vote of all, and on the special advice of Carrasco, that Don Quixote should be allowed to go, as it seemed impossible to restrain him, and that Samson should sally forth to meet him as a knight-errant, and do battle with him, for there would be no difficulty about the cause, and vanquish him, that being looked upon as an easy matter, and that it should be agreed and settled that the vanquished was to be at the mercy of the victor. Then Don Quixote being vanquished, the bachelor knight was to command him to return to his village and his house, and not quit it for 2 years, or until he received further orders from him, all which it was clear Don Quixote would unhesitatingly obey, rather than contravene or fail to observe the laws of chivalry, and during the period of his seclusion he might perhaps forget his folly, or there might be an opportunity of discovering some ready remedy for his madness. Carrasco undertook the task, and Tom Cecial, a gossip and neighbor of Sancho Panza's, a lively, feather-headed fellow, offered himself as his squire. Carrasco armed himself in the fashion described, and Tom Cecial, that he might not be known by his gossip when they met, fitted on over his own natural nose the false masquerade one that has been mentioned, and so they followed the same route Don Quixote took, and almost came up with him in time to be present in the venture of the cart of death, and finally encountered them in the grove, where all that the sagacious reader has been reading about took place. And had it not been for the extraordinary fancies of Don Quixote, and his conviction that the bachelor was not the bachelor, Signor Bachelor would have been incapacitated forever from taking his degree of licentiate, or through not finding nests where he thought to find birds. Tom Cecial, seeing how ill they had succeeded, and what a sorry end the expedition had come to, said to the bachelor, "Sure enough, Signor Samson Carrasco, we are served right. It is easy enough to plan and set about an enterprise, but it is often a difficult matter to come well out of it. Don Quixote a madman, and we sane. He goes off laughing safe and sound, and you are left sore and sorry. I'd like to know now which is the matter, he who is so because he cannot help it, or he who is so of his own choice." To which Samson replied, "The difference between the two sorts of madmen is, that he who is so will he nil he, will be one always, while he who is so of his own accord can leave off being one whenever he likes. In that case, said Tom Cecial, I was a madman of my own accord when I volunteered to become your squire, and of my own accord I'll leave off being one and go home." "That's your affair," returned Samson, but to suppose that I am going home until I have given Don Quixote a thrashing is absurd, and it is not any wish that he may recover his senses that will make me hunt him out now, but a wish for the sore pain I am in with my ribs won't let me entertain more charitable thoughts. Thus discoursing, the pair proceeded until they reached a town where it was their good luck to find a bone setter, with whose help the unfortunate Samson was cured. Tom Cecial left him and went home, while he stayed behind meditating vengeance, and the history will return to him again at the proper time, so as not to omit making merry with Don Quixote now.
好，呢一節讀到嚟呢一度，解釋咗咧呢個 Samson 點解要冒充做呢個森林嘅騎士，而去挑戰 Don Quixote 啦。原來佢就係同個爸爸同個 licentiate 係一伙嘅，咁佢就應承咗佢哋咧，就假扮騎士，然之後咧挑戰 Don Quixote，將佢擊倒，然之後咧就以遊俠條約去束綁佢，就令到佢咧唔再履行騎士嘅職責。就叫佢留喺屋企休養，哪怕係2年。以 Don Quixote 嘅性格，佢必須係會遵守嘅。咁起碼都會有2年時間 Don Quixote 留喺屋企先啦。咁喺呢段時間，你或者會諗到一啲其他嘅方法去醫好佢嘅病咧咁樣。但係點知咧 Carrasco 打輸喎。佢亦都意興闌珊，因為實在太空啦。呢個被擊敗嘅時候，佢亦都諗唔到有啲咩方法可以繼續去說服 Don Quixote。於是乎咧，佢都係決定翻去療傷。而佢嘅侍從 Tom Cecial 反而咧就冇咁容易放棄喎。喺文中最後提到，佢咧係依然會揾機會伺機去報仇啊！唔明白點解 Tom Cecial 會有一個深仇大恨。不過呢一刻佢似乎就心生不忿。呢個字有一個字同大家分享 ，vainglorious， vainglorious， vainglorious 形容詞嚟嘅 ，excessively proud of oneself or one's achievements，overly vain 會有虛榮心嘅，呢個都可以解做自負啦嚇，覺得自己咧就係好犀利啦，好巴閉啦。Don Quixote咧呢一刻，因為佢係好漂亮地打低對手啦，於是乎咧就飄飄然啊。好，我呢一節讀到呢度，下一節仲繼續讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅 Chapter 16第16節，呢節嘅名叫做 Of What Befell Don Quixote with a Discreet Gentleman of La Mancha。咁上一回咧，終於真相大白啦。Carrasco 同埋佢嘅侍從 Cecial 咧，原來都係識得嘅，就係 Don Quixote 身邊嘅人啦，同埋 Sancho 身邊嘅鄰居啊。其實只不過就係假扮嘅事，然之後咧就誘騙 Don Quixote 同佢哋對決，擊倒咗 Don Quixote之後咧，以遊俠條約就將佢暫時幽禁或者將佢封鎖喺佢自己屋企啦，等佢唔可以四出作嗰啲遊客活動啦。結果一個出於善意嘅陰謀就敗露啦。咁當 Quixote 呢一刻咧擊敗咗對手咧，就內心有啲飄飄然。咁我哋睇下當 Quixote 呢一刻又會講啲咩豪言壯語啊
？Don Quixote pursued his journey in the high spirits, satisfaction, and self-complacency already described, fancying himself the most valorous knight-errant of the age in the world because of his late victory. All the adventures that could befall him from the time forth he regarded as already done and brought to a happy issue. He made light of enchantments and enchanters. He thought no more of the countless drubbings that had been administered to him in the course of his knight-errantry, nor of the volley of stones that had levelled half his teeth, nor of the ingratitude of the galley slaves, nor of the audacity of the Yangusians and the shower of stakes that fell upon him. In short, he said to himself that could he discover any means, mode, or way of disenchanting his lady Dulcinea, he would not envy the highest fortune that the most fortunate knight-errant of yore ever reached or could reach. He was going along entirely absorbed in these fancies, when Sancho said to him, "Isn't it odd, Señor, that I have still before my eyes that monstrous, enormous nose of my gossip, Tom Cecial? And dost thou, then, believe, Sancho, said Don Quixote, that the knight of the mirrors was the bachelor Carrasco, and his squire Tom Cecial thy gossip. I don't know what to say to that, replied Sancho. All I know is that the tokens he gave me about my own house, wife, and children, nobody else but himself could have given me, and the face, once the nose was off, was the very face of Tom Cecial, as I have seen it many a time in my town and next door to my own house, and the sound of the voice was just the same. Let us reason the matter, Sancho, said Don Quixote. Come now, by what process of thinking can it be supposed that the bachelor Samson Carrasco would come as a knight-errant, in arms offensive and defensive, to fight with me? Have I ever been by any chance his enemy? Have I ever given him any occasion to owe me a grudge? Am I his rival, or does he profess arms, that he should envy the fame I have acquired in them? Well, but what are we to say, Señor, returned Sancho, about the knight, whoever he is, being so like the bachelor Carrasco, and his squire so like my gossip, Tom Cecial? And if that be enchantment, as your worship says, was there no other pair in the world for them to take their likeness of? It is all, said Don Quixote, a scheme and plot of the malignant magicians that persecute me, who, foreseeing that I was to be victorious in the conflict, arranged that the vanquished knight should display the countenance of my friend the bachelor, in order that the friendship I bear him should interpose to stay the edge of my sword and might of my arm, and temper the just wrath of my heart, so that he who sought to take my life by fraud and falsehood should save his own. And to prove it, thou knowest already, Sancho, by experience which cannot lie or deceive, how easy it is for enchanters to change one countenance into another, turning fair into foul, and foul into fair. For it is not 2 days since thou sawest with thine own eyes the beauty and elegance of the peerless Dulcinea in all its perfection and natural harmony, while I saw her in the repulsive and mean form of a coarse country wench, with cataracts in her eyes and a foul smell in her mouth. And when the perverse enchanter ventured to effect so wicked a transformation, it is no wonder if he effected that of Samson Carrasco and thy gossip in order to snatch the glory of victory out of my grasp. For all that, however, I console myself, because after all, in whatever shape he may have been, I have been victorious over my enemy. God knows what's the truth of it all, said Sancho, and knowing as he did that the transformation of Dulcinea had been a device and imposition of his own, his master's illusions were not satisfactory to him, but he did not like to reply lest he should say something that might disclose his trickery. As they were engaged in this conversation, they were overtaken by a man who was following the same road behind them, mounted on a very handsome flea-bitten mare, and dressed in a gabin of fine green cloth, with tawny velvet facings, and a montera of the same velvet. The trappings of the mare were of the field and Janetta fashion, and of mulberry colour and green. He carried a Moorish cutlass hanging from a broad green and gold baldric. The buskins were of the same make as the baldric. The spurs were not gilt, but lacquered green, and so brightly polished that, matching as they did the rest of his apparel, they looked better than if they had been of pure gold. When the traveller came up with them, he saluted them courteously, and spurring his mare was passing them without stopping. But Don Quixote called out to him, "Gallant sir, if so be your worship is going our road, and has no occasion for speed, it would be a pleasure to me if we were to join company." "In truth," replied he on the mare, "I would not pass you so hastily but for fear that horse might turn restive in the company of my mare." "You may safely hold in your mare, Señor," said Sancho in reply to this, "for our horse is the most virtuous and well-behaved horse in the world. He never does anything wrong on such occasions, and the only time he misbehaved, my master and I suffered for it sevenfold. I say again, your worship may pull up if you like, for if she was offered to him between two plates, the horse would not hanker after her." The traveller drew rein, amazed at the trim and features of Don Quixote, who rode without his helmet, which Sancho carried like a valise in front of Dapple's pack saddle. And if the man in green examined Don Quixote closely, still more closely did Don Quixote examine the man in green, who struck him as being a man of intelligence. In appearance he was about 50 years of age, with but few grey hairs, an aquiline cast of features, and an expression between grave and gay, and his dress and accoutrements showed him to be a man of good condition. What he in green thought of Don Quixote of La Mancha was that a man of that sort and shape he had never yet seen. He marvelled at the length of his hair, his lofty stature, the lankness and sallowness of his countenance, his armour, his bearing, and his gravity, a figure and picture such as had not been seen in those regions for many a long day. Don Quixote saw very plainly the attention with which the traveller was regarding him, and read his curiosity in his astonishment, and courteous as he was, and ready to please everybody, before the other could ask him any question he anticipated him by saying, "The appearance I present to your worship being so strange and so out of the common, I should not be surprised if it filled you with wonder, but you will cease to wonder when I tell you, as I do, that I am one of those knights who, as people say, go seeking adventures. I have left my home, I have mortgaged my estate, I have given up my comforts, and committed myself to the arms of fortune, to bear me whithersoever she may please. My desire was to bring to life again knight-errantry, now dead, and for some time past stumbling here, falling there, now coming down headlong, now raising myself up again. I have carried out a great portion of my design, succouring widows, protecting maidens, and giving aid to wives, orphans, and minors, the proper and natural duty of knights-errant. And therefore, because of my many valiant and Christian achievements, I have been already found worthy to make my way in print to well nigh all, almost, of the nations of the earth. 30,000 volumes of my history have been printed, and it is on the high road to be printed 30,000 thousands of times, if heaven does not put a stop to it. In short, to sum up all in a few words, or in a single one, I may tell you I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, otherwise called the Knight of the Rueful Countenance. For though self-praise is degrading, I must perforce sound my own sometimes, that is to say, when there is no one at hand to do it for me. So that, gentle sir, neither this horse, nor this lance, nor this shield, nor this squire, nor all these arms put together, nor the sallowness of my countenance, nor my gaunt leanness, will henceforth astonish you, now that you know who I am, and what profession I follow." With these words, Don Quixote held his peace, and from the time he took to answer, the man in green seemed to be at a loss for a reply. After a long pause, however, he said to him, "You were right when you saw curiosity in my amazement, Sir Knight, but you have not succeeded in removing the astonishment I feel at seeing you. For although you say, Signor, that knowing who you are ought to remove it, it has not done so. On the contrary, now that I know, I am left more amazed and astonished than before. What? Is it possible that there are knights-errant in the world in these days, and histories of real chivalry printed? I cannot realize the fact that there can be anyone on earth nowadays who aids widows, or protects maidens, or defends wives, or succors orphans, nor should I believe it had I not seen it in your worship with my own eyes. Blessed be heaven, for by means of this history of your noble and genuine chivalrous deeds, which you say has been printed, the countless stories of fictitious knights-errant with which the world is filled, so much to the injury of morality and the prejudice and discredit of good histories, will have been driven into oblivion. There is a good deal to be said on that point, said Don Quixote, as to whether the histories of the knights-errant are fiction or not. Why, is there anyone who doubts that those histories are false? Said the man in green. I doubt it, said Don Quixote, but never mind that just now. If our journey lasts long enough, I trust in God I shall show your worship that you do wrong in going with the stream of those who regard it as a matter of certainty that they are not true. From this last observation of Don Quixote's, the traveller began to have a suspicion that he was some crazy being, and was waiting for him to confirm it by something further. But before they could turn to any new subject, Don Quixote begged him to tell him who he was, since he himself had rendered account of his station in life. To this, he in the green gaban replied, I, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, am a gentleman by birth, native of the village where, please God, we are going to dine today. I am more than fairly well off, and my name is Don Diego de Miranda. I pass my life with my wife, children, and friends. My pursuits are hunting and fishing, but I keep neither hawks or greyhounds, nothing but a tame partridge or a bold ferret or two. I have 6 dozen or so of books, some in our mother tongue, some Latin, some of them history, others devotional. Those of chivalry have not as yet crossed the threshold of my door. I am more given to turning over the profane than the devotional, so long as they are books of honest entertainment that charm by their style and attract an interest by the invention they display, though of these there are very few in Spain. Sometimes I dine with my neighbours and friends, and often invite them. My entertainments are neat and well served without stint of anything. I have no taste for tattle, nor do I allow tattling in my presence. I pry not into my neighbours' lives, nor have I lynx eyes for what others do. I hear mass every day. I share my substance with the poor, making no display of good works, lest I let hypocrisy and vainglory, those enemies that subtly take possession of the most watchful heart, find an entrance into mine. I strive to make peace between those whom I know to be at variance. I am the devoted servant of Our Lady, and my trust is ever in the infinite mercy of God our Lord. Sancho listened with the greatest attention to the account of the gentleman's life and occupation, and thinking it a good and a holy life, and that he who led it ought to work miracles, he threw himself off Dapple, and running in haste seized his right stirrup, and kissed his foot again and again with a devout heart and almost with tears. Seeing this, the gentleman asked him, "What are you about, brother? What are these kisses for?" "Let me kiss," said Sancho, "for I think your worship is the first saint in the saddle I ever saw all the days of my life." "I am no saint," replied the gentleman, "but a great sinner. But you are, brother, for you must be a good fellow, as your simplicity shows." Sancho went back and regained his pack saddle, having extracted a laugh from his master's profound melancholy, and excited fresh amazement in Don Diego. Don Quixote then asked him how many children he had, and observed that one of the things wherein the ancient philosophers, who were without the true knowledge of God, placed the summum bonum was in the gifts of nature, in those of fortune, in having many friends, and many and good children. "I, Señor Don Quixote," answered the gentleman, "have one son, without whom perhaps I should count myself happier than I am, not because he is a bad son, but because he is not as good as I could wish. He is 18 years of age. He has been for 6 at Salamanca studying Latin and Greek, and when I wished him to turn to the study of other sciences, I found him so wrapped up in that of poetry that there is no getting him to take kindly to the law, which I wished him to study, or to theology, the queen of them all. I would like him to be an honour to his family, as we live in days when our kings liberally reward learning that is virtuous and worthy, for learning without virtue is a pearl on a dunghill. He spends the whole day in settling whether Homer expressed himself correctly or not in such and such a line of the Iliad, whether Martial was indecent or not in such and such an epigram, whether such and such lines of Virgil are to be understood in this way or in that. In short, all his talk is of the works of those poets, and those of Horace, Persius, Junifer, and Tibullus, for of the moderns in our own language he makes no great account, but with all his seeming indifference to Spanish poetry, just now his thoughts are absorbed in making a gloss on 4 lines that have been sent him from Salamanca, which I suspect are for some poetical tournament. To all this Don Quixote said in reply, "Children, Señor, are portions of their parents' bowels, and therefore, be they good or bad, are to be loved as we love the souls that give us life. It is for the parents to guide them from infancy in the ways of virtue, propriety, and worthy Christian conduct, so that when grown up they may be the staff of their parents' old age, and the glory of their posterity. And to force them to study this or that science I do not think wise, though it may be no harm to persuade them. And when there is no need to study for the sake of making a lot of money, and it is the student's good fortune that heaven has given him parents who provide him with it, it would be my advice to them to let him pursue whatever science they may see him most inclined to. And though that of poetry is less useful than pleasurable, it is not one of those that bring discredit upon the possessor. Poetry, gentle sir, is, as I take it, like a tender young maiden of supreme beauty to a ray, Bedeck, and adorn whom is the task of several other maidens, who are all the rest of the sciences, and she must avail herself of the help of all, and all derive their lustre from her. But this maiden will not bear to be handled, nor dragged through the streets, nor exposed either at the corners of the marketplaces or in the closets of palaces. She is the product of an alchemy of such virtue that he who is able to practice it will turn her into pure gold of inestimable worth. He that possesses her must keep her within bounds, not permitting her to break out in ribald satires or soulless sonnets. She must on no account be offered for sale, unless indeed it be in heroic poems, moving tragedies, or sprightly and ingenious comedies. She must not be touched by buffoons, nor by the ignorant vulgar, incapable of comprehending or appreciating her hidden treasures. And do not suppose, Signor, that I apply the term vulgar here merely to plebeians and the lower orders, for everyone who is ignorant, be he lord or prince, may and should be included among the vulgar. He, then, who shall embrace and cultivate poetry under the conditions I have named, shall become famous, and his name honored throughout all the civilized nations of the earth. And with regard to what you say, Signor, of your son having no great opinion of Spanish poetry, I am inclined to think that he is not quite right there, and for this reason the great poet Homer did not write in Latin, because he was a Greek, nor did Virgil write in Greek, because he was Latin. In short, all the ancient poets wrote in the language they imbibed with their mother's milk, and never went in quest of foreign ones and expressed their sublime conceptions. And that being so, the usage should in justice extend to all nations, and the German poet should not be undervalued because he writes in his own language, nor the Castilian, nor even the Biscayan, for writing in his. But your son, Signor, I suspect, is not prejudiced against Spanish poetry, but against those poets who are mere Spanish verse writers, without any knowledge of other languages or sciences to adorn and give life and vigor to their natural inspiration. And yet even in this he may be wrong, for, according to a true belief, a poet is born one. That is to say, the poet by nature comes forth a poet from his mother's womb, and following the bent that heaven has bestowed upon him, without the aid of study or art, he produces things that show how truly he spoke who said, God is in us, etc. At the same time, I say that the poet by nature who calls in art to his aid will be a far better poet, and will surpass him who tries to be one relying upon his knowledge of art alone. The reason is that art does not surpass nature, but only brings it to perfection, and thus nature combined with art and art with nature will produce a perfect poet. To bring my argument to a close, I would say then, gentle sir, let your son go on as his star leads him, for being so studious as he seems to be, and having already successfully surmounted the first step of the sciences, which is that of the languages, with their help he will, by his own exertions, reach the summit of polite literature, which so well becomes an independent gentleman, and adorns, honors, and distinguishes him, as much as the mitre does the bishop, or the gown the learned counsellor. If your son write satires reflecting on the honour of others, chide and correct him, and tear them up. But if he compose discourses in which he rebukes vice in general, in the style of Horace, and with elegance like his, commend him, for it is legitimate for a poet to write against envy and lash the envious in his verse, and the other vices too, provided he does not single out individuals. There are, however, poets who, for the sake of saying something spiteful, would run the risk of being banished to the coast of Pontus. If the poet be sure in his morals, he will be pure in his verses too. The pen is the tongue of the mind, and as the thought engendered there, so will be the things that it writes down. And when knights and princes observes this marvelous science of poetry in wise, virtuous, and thoughtful subjects, they honor, value, exalt them, and even crown them with the leaves of that tree which the thunderbolt strikes not, as if to show that they whose brows are honored and adorned with such a crown are not to be assailed by anyone. He of the green gaban was filled with astonishment at Don Quixote's argument, so much so that he began to abandon the notion he had taken up about his being crazy. But in the middle of the discourse, it being not very much to his taste, Sancho had turned aside out of the road to beg a little milk from some shepherds, who were milking their ewes hard by. And just as the gentleman, highly pleased, was about to renew the conversation, Don Quixote, raising his head, perceived a cart covered with royal flags coming along the road they were travelling, and persuaded that this must be some new adventure. He called aloud to Sancho to come and bring him his helmet. Sancho, hearing himself called, quitted the shepherds, and prodding Dapple vigorously, came up to his master, to whom there fell a terrific and desperate adventure.
好，呢一節讀到嚟呢一度，呢一節主要係 Don Quixote 嘅一個思辨啊。再次作者透過 Don Quixote 嘅口就講出咗佢對於文學進修者嘅一啲諗法啊。文中出現咗一個路過嘅人，咁佢個仔咧喺城入邊進修緊文學，詩詞歌賦咁啦。就似你嘅爸爸就唔係好滿意，因為佢咧就想佢做一啲專業，咁但係個仔咧就修文學。而Don Quixote咧就話，既然你個仔有興趣始志要讀文學咧，你應該有佢嘅。佢話因為咧呢啲文學嘅修養或者思想咧係天賦嘅、先天嘅。 既然個天要俾呢個才華咧，就唔可以埋沒佢。而既然佢寫出嚟嘅詩歌係漂亮嘅，係有文采嘅，就更加要支持佢。調翻轉佢寫啲嘢係猥褻嘅，咁你應該責備佢啦。但係佢唔係，咁咧你就應該支持佢。於是乎咧，呢個老個人原本都覺得，哇！呢個 Don Quixote 呢個遊俠思想塞滿咗個腦，係咪傻㗎？但係聽完佢啲詩辯之後咧，佢都不免咧要收翻呢個諗法。對話嚟到呢度嘅時候咧，Don Quixote就發現咗附近咧有馬車掛住皇室嘅旗，咁就似咧大家咧都非常之雀躍。好，我哋睇下呢一節有啲咩字同大家分享。可能分享一個拉丁詞啊，一個名詞嚟嘅 summum bonum。The highest good, especially as the ultimate goal, according to which values and priorities are established in an ethical system。中文會翻譯做至善啦，或者高特。我平時就喺文中出現拉丁文，我都會盡量翻譯做英文讀出嚟，因為好多英文字典都冇個字啦。拉丁文即係好難揾到讀音啦，咁我亦都唔想誤導大家，所以我就會索性將佢轉做英文嘅意思讀出嚟。不過呢一個字咧 summum bonum 咧就有嘅，於是乎我就同大家分享啦。Epigram 比較少見啊，而家名詞嚟嘅。中文即金句啊、證據啊、啲詼諧嘅短詩。A pithy saying or remark expressing an idea in a clever and amusing way. Imbibe, I-M-B-I-B-E， 動詞嚟嘅，即係飲酒、飲用一啲有酒精含量嘅嘢。Imbibe。好，呢一節讀到呢度，下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅 Chapter 17， 第17節啦。呢一節嘅名叫做 Wherein is shown the furthest and highest point which the unexampled courage of Don Quixote reached or could reach, together with the happily achieved adventure of the lions。 聽個題目似乎會出現獅子。點解會出現獅子喺西班牙呢個地方咧？奇怪啦！咁我哋可以睇下發生咩事。佢哋咧就見到咧迎面而嚟有一啲皇室旗幟喺度，即係似乎有事或者有啲尊貴嘅事會發生。咁我睇下佢哋會唔會湊熱鬧啦。
The history tells that when Don Quixote called out to Sancho to bring him his helmet,Sancho was buying some curds the shepherds agreed to sell him, and flurried by the great haste his master was in, did not know what to do with them or what to carry them in. So, not to lose them, for he had already paid for them, he thought it best to throw them into his master's helmet, and acting on his bright idea, he went to see what his master wanted with him. He, as he approached, exclaimed to him, "Give me that helmet, my friend, for either I know little of adventures,or what I observe yonder is one that will, and thus, call upon me to arm myself." He of the green gaban, on hearing this, looked in all directions, but could perceive nothing, except a cart coming towards them with 2 or 3 small flags, which led them to conclude it must be carrying treasures of the king's, and he said so to Don Quixote. He, however, would not believe him, being always persuaded and convinced that all that happened to him must be adventures, and still more adventures. So he replied to the gentleman, "He who is prepared has his battle half fought. Nothing is lost by my preparing myself, for I know by experience that I have enemies, visible and invisible, and I know not when, or where, or at what moment, or in what shapes they will attack me." And turning to Sancho, he called for his helmet, and Sancho, as he had no time to take out the curds, had to give it just as it was. Don Quixote took it, and without perceiving what was in it, thrust it down in hot haste upon his head. But as the curds were pressed and squeezed, the whey began to run all over his face and beard, whereat he was so startled that he cried out to Sancho, "Sancho, what's this? I think my head is softening, or my brains are melting, or I am sweating from head to foot. If I am sweating, it is not indeed from fear. I am convinced beyond a doubt that the adventure which is about to befall me is a terrible one. Give me something to wipe myself with, if thou haste it, for this profuse sweat is blinding me." Sancho held his tongue, and gave him a cloth, and gave thanks to God at the same time that his master had not found out what was the matter. Don Quixote then wiped himself and took off his helmet to see what it was that made his head feel so cool. And seeing all that white mesh inside his helmet, he put it to his nose, and as soon as he had smelt it, he exclaimed, "By the life of my lady Dulcinea El Toboso, but it is curds thou hast put here, thou treacherous, impudent, ill-mannered squire." To which, with great composure and pretended innocence, Sancho replied, "If they are curds, let me have them, your worship, and I'll eat them. But let the devil eat them, for it must have been he who put them there. I dare to dirty your helmet. You have guessed the offender finely. Faith, sir, by the light God gives me, it seems I must have enchanters too, that persecute me as a creature and limb of your worship, and they must have put that nastiness there in order to provoke your patience to anger, and make you base my ribs as you are wont to do. Well, this time indeed they have missed their aim. For I trust to my master's good sense to see that I have got no curds or milk or anything of the sort, and that if I had it is in my stomach, I would put it and not in the helmet." "Maybe so," said Don Quixote. All this the gentleman was observing, and with astonishment, more especially when, after having wiped himself clean, his head, face, beard, and helmet, Don Quixote put it on, and settling himself firmly in his stirrups, easing his sword in the scabbard, and grasping his lance, he cried, "Now come who will, here am I, ready to try conclusions with Satan himself in person." By this time the cart with the flags had come up, unattended by anyone except the carter on a mule, and a man sitting in front. Don Quixote planted himself before it and said, "Whither are you going, brothers? What cart is this? What have you got in it? What flags are those?" To this the carter replied, "The cart is mine. What is in it is a pair of wild caged lions, which the governor of Oran is sending to court as a present to his majesty, and the flags are our lord the king's, to show that what is here is his property." "And are the lions large?" asked Don Quixote. "So large," replied the man who sat at the door of the cart, "that larger, or as large, have never crossed from Africa to Spain. I am the keeper, and I have brought over others, but never any like these. They are male and female. The male is in that first cage, and female in the one behind, and they are hungry now, for they have eaten nothing today. So let your worship stand aside, for we must make haste to the place where we are to feed them." Hereupon, smiling slightly, Don Quixote exclaimed, "Lion whelps to me whelps of lions in such a time. Then by God, those gentlemen who sent them here shall see if I am a man to be frightened by lions. Get down, my good fellow, and as you are the keeper, open the cages, and turn me out those beasts, and in the midst of this plain I will let them know who Don Quixote of La Mancha is, in spite and in the teeth of the enchanters who sent them to me." So, said the gentleman to himself at this, "our worthy knight has shown of what sort he is. The curds, no doubt, have softened his skull and brought his brains to a head." At this instant Sancho came up to him, saying, "Señor, for God's sake do something to keep my master Don Quixote from tackling these lions, for if he does, they'll tear us all to pieces here." "Is your master then mad," asked the gentleman, "that you believe and are afraid he will engage such fierce animals?" "He is not mad," said Sancho, "but he is venturesome." "I will prevent it," said the gentleman, and going over to Don Quixote, who was insisting upon the keeper's opening the cages, he said to him, "Sir Knight, knights errant should attempt adventures which encourage the hope of a successful issue, not those which entirely withhold it. For valor that trenches upon temerity savours rather of madness than of courage. Moreover, these lions do not come to oppose you, nor do they dream of such a thing. They are going as presents to his majesty, and it will not be right to stop them or delay their journey." "Gentle sir," replied Don Quixote, "you go and mind your tame partridge and your bold ferret, and leave everyone to manage his own business. This is mine, and I know whether these gentlemen the lions come to me or not." And then turning to the keeper, he exclaimed, "By all that's good, sir scoundrel, if you don't open the cages this very instant, I'll pin you to the cart with this lance." The carter, seeing the determination of this apparition in armour, said to him, "Please, your worship, for charity's sake, Señor, let me unyoke the mules and place myself in safety along with them before the lions are turned out, for if they kill them on me, I'm ruined for life, for all I possess is this cart and mules." "A man of little faith," replied Don Quixote, "get down and unyoke. You will soon see that you are exerting yourself for nothing, and that you might have spared yourself the trouble." The carter got down and with all speed unyoked the mules, and the keeper called out at the top of his voice, "I call all here to witness that against my will and under compulsion I opened the cages and let the lions loose, and that I warn this gentleman that he will be accountable for all the harm and mischief which these beasts may do, and for my salary and dues as well. You, gentlemen, place yourself in safety before I open, for I know they will do me no harm." Once more the gentleman strove to persuade Don Quixote not to do such a mad thing, as it was tempting God to engage in such a piece of folly. To this, Don Quixote replied that he knew what he was about. The gentleman returned and entreated him to reflect, for he knew he was under a delusion. "Well, Signor," answered Don Quixote, "if you do not like to be a spectator of this tragedy, as in your opinion it will be, spur your flea-bitten mare, and place yourself in safety." Hearing this, Sancho, with tears in his eyes, entreated him to give up an enterprise compared with which the one of the windmills, and the awful one of the fulling mills, and, in fact, all the feats he had attempted in the whole course of his life, were cakes and fancy bread. "Look ye, Signor," said Sancho, "there's no enchantment here, nor anything of the sort, for between the bars and chinks of the cage I have seen the paw of a real lion, and judging by that, I reckon the lion with such a paw could belong to must be bigger than a mountain." "Fear at any rate," replied Don Quixote, "will make him look bigger to thee than half the world. Retire, Sancho, and leave me, and if I die here thou knowest our old compact, that thou wilt repair to Dulcinea, I say no more." To these he added some further words that banished all hope of his giving up his insane project. He of the green gaban would have offered resistance, but he found himself ill-matched as to arms, and did not think it prudent to come to blows with a madman, for such Don Quixote now showed himself to be in every respect, and the latter, renewing his commands to the keeper and repeating his threats, gave warning to the gentleman to spur his mare, Sancho his dapple, and the carter his mules, all striving to get away from the cart as far as they could before the lions broke loose. Sancho was weeping over his master's death, for this time he firmly believed it was in store for him from the claws of the lions, and he cursed his fate and called it an unlucky hour when he thought of taking service with him again. But with all his tears and lamentations, he did not forget to thrash Dapple so as to put a good space between himself and the cart. The keeper, seeing that the fugitives were now some distance off, once more entreated and warned him as before, but he replied that he heard him, and that he need not trouble himself with any further warnings or entreaties, as they would be fruitless, and bade him make haste. During the delay that occurred while the keeper was opening the first cage, Don Quixote was considering whether it would not be well to do battle on foot instead of on horseback, and finally resolved to fight on foot, fearing that Rocinante might take fright at the sight of the lions. He therefore sprang off his horse, flung his lance aside, braced his buckler on his arm, and drawing his sword, advanced slowly with marvelous intrepidity and resolute courage, to plant himself in front of the cart, commending himself with all his heart to God and to his lady Dulcinea. It is to be observed that on coming to this passage, the author of this veracious history breaks out into exclamations, "O doughty Don Quixote, high mettle past extolling, mirror, wherein all the heroes of the world may see themselves, second modern Don Manuel de Leon, once the glory and honor of Spanish knighthood. In what words should I describe this dread exploit? By what language shall I make it credible to ages to come? What eulogies are there unmeet for thee, though they be hyperboles piled on hyperboles? On foot alone, undaunted, high-souled, with but a simple sword, and that no trenchant blade of the perillo brand, a shield, but no bright polished steel one, there stoodst thou, bidding and awaiting the two fiercest lions that Africa's forests ever bred. Thy own deeds be thy praise, valiant Manchegan, and here I leave them as they stand, wanting the words wherewith to glorify them." Here the author's outburst came to an end, and he proceeded to take up the thread of his story, saying that the keeper, seeing that Don Quixote had taken up his position, and that it was impossible for him to avoid letting out the mail without incurring the enmity of the fiery and daring knight, flung open the doors of the first cage, containing, as has been said, the lion, which was now seen to be of enormous size and grim and hideous mien. The first thing he did was to turn round in the cage in which he lay, and protrude his claws and stretch himself thoroughly. He next opened his mouth, and yawned very leisurely, and with near 2 palms length of tongue that he had thrust forth, he licked the dust out of his eyes and washed his face. Having done this, he put his head out of the cage and looked all round with eyes like glowing coals, a spectacle and demeanour to strike terror into temerity itself. Don Quixote merely observed him steadily, longing for him to leap from the cart and come to close quarters with him, when he hoped to hew him in pieces. So far did his unparalleled madness go, but the noble lion, more courteous than arrogant, not troubling himself about silly bravado, after having looked all round, as has been said, turned about and presented his hindquarters to Don Quixote, and very coolly and tranquilly lay down again in the cage. Seeing this, Don Quixote ordered the keeper to take a stick to him and provoke him to make him come out. That I won't, said the keeper, for if I anger him, the first he'll tear in pieces will be myself. Be satisfied, Sir Knight, with what you have done, which leaves nothing more to be said on the score of courage, and do not seek to tempt fortune a second time. The lion has the door open, he is free to come out or not to come out, but as he has not come out so far, he will not come out today. Your worship's great courage has been fully manifested already. No brave champion, so it strikes me, is bound to do more than challenge his enemy and wait for him on the field. If his adversary does not come, on him lies the disgrace, and he who waits for him carries off the crown of victory. That is true, said Don Quixote. Close the door, my friend, and let me have, in the best form thou canst, what thou hast seen me do, by way of certificate, to wit, that thou didst open for the lion, that I waited for him, that he did not come out, that I still waited for him, and that still he did not come out and lay down again. I am not bound to do more. Enchantments avaunt, and God uphold the right, the truth, and true chivalry. Close the door as I bade thee, while I make signals to the fugitives that have left us, that they may learn this exploit from thy lips. The keeper obeyed, and Don Quixote, fixing on the point of his lance the cloth he had wiped his face with after the deluge of curds, proceeded to recall the others, who still continued to fly, looking back at every step, all in a body, the gentleman bringing up the rear. Sancho, however, happening to observe the signal of the white cloth, exclaimed, May I die if my master has not overcome the wild beasts, for he is calling to us. They all stopped, and perceived that it was Don Quixote who was making signals, and shaking off their fears to some extent, they approached slowly until they were near enough to hear distinctly Don Quixote's voice calling to them. They returned at length to the cart, and as they came up, Don Quixote said to the carter, Put your mules to once more, brother, and continue your journey. And do thou, Sancho, give him 2 gold crowns for himself and the keeper, to compensate for the delay they have incurred through me. That will I give with all my heart, said Sancho. But what has become of the lions? Are they dead or alive? The keeper then, in full detail and bit by bit, described the end of the contest, exulting to the best of his power and ability the valour of Don Quixote, at the sight of whom the lion quailed, and would not and dare not come out of the cage, although he had held the door open ever so long, and showing how, in consequence of his having represented to the knight that it was tempting God to provoke the lion in order to force him out, which he wished to have done, he very reluctantly, and altogether against his will, had allowed the door to be closed. What dost thou think of this, Sancho? Said Don Quixote. Are there any enchantments that can prevail against true valour? The enchanters may be able to rob me of good fortune, but of fortitude and courage they cannot. Sancho paid the crowns, the carter put to. The keeper kissed Don Quixote's hands for the bounty bestowed upon him, and promised to give an account of the valiant exploit to the king himself, as soon as he saw him at court. Then, said Don Quixote, if his majesty should happen to ask who performed it, you must say the Knight of the Lions, for it is my desire that into this the name I have hitherto borne of Knight of the Rueful Countenance be from this time forward changed, altered, transformed, and turned. And in this I follow the ancient usage of knights-errant, who change their names when they please, or when it suited their purpose. The cart went its way, and Don Quixote, Sancho, and he of the green gaban went theirs. All this time, Don Diego de Miranda had not spoken a word, being entirely taken up with observing and noting all that Don Quixote did and said, and the opinion he formed was that he was a man of brains gone mad, and a madman on the verge of rationality. The first part of his history had not yet reached him, for, had he read it, the amazement with which his words and deeds filled him would have vanished, as he would then have understood the nature of his madness. But knowing nothing of it, he took him to be rational one moment, and crazy the next, for what he said was sensible, elegant, and well expressed, and what he did absurd, rash, and foolish. And said he to himself, what could be madder than putting on a helmet full of curds, and then persuading oneself that enchanters are softening one's skull? Or what could be greater rashness and folly than wanting to fight lions tooth and nail? Don Quixote roused him from these reflections and this soliloquy by saying, "No doubt, Señor Don Diego de Miranda, you set me down in your mind as a fool and a madman, and it would be no wonder if you did, for my deeds do not argue anything else. But for all that, I would have you take notice that I am neither so mad nor so foolish as I must have seemed to you. A gallant knight shows to advantage bringing his lance to bear adroitly upon a fierce bull under the eyes of his sovereign, in the midst of a spacious plaza. A knight shows to advantage arrayed in glittering armor, pacing the lists before the ladies in some joyous tournament. And all those knights show to advantage that entertain, divert, and if we may say so, honor the courts of their princes by warlike exercises, or what resemble them. But to greater advantage than all these does a knight-errant show when he traverses deserts, solitudes, crossroads, forests, and mountains, in quest of perilous adventures, bent on bringing them to a happy and successful issue, all to win a glorious and lasting renown. To greater advantage, I maintain, does the knight-errant show bringing aid to some widow in some lonely waste, than the court knight dallying with some city damsel. All knights have their own special parts to play. Let the courtier devote himself to ladies. Let him add lustre to his sovereign's court by his liveries. Let him entertain poor gentlemen with the sumptuous fare of his table. Let him arrange joustings, martial tournaments, and prove himself noble, generous, and magnificent, and above all a good Christian. And so doing, he will fulfill the duties that are especially his. But let the knight-errant explore the corner of the earth and penetrate the most intricate labyrinths. At each step, let him attempt impossibilities. On desolate heaths, let him endure the burning rays of the midsummer sun and the bitter inclemency of the winter winds and frosts. Let no lions daunt him, no monsters terrify him, no dragons make him quail. For to seek these, to attack those, and to vanquish all, are in truth his main duties. I, then, as it has fallen to my lot to be a member of knight-errantry, cannot avoid attempting all that to me seems to come within the sphere of my duties. Thus it was my bounden duty to attack those lions that I just now attacked, although I knew it to be the height of rashness, for I know well what valor is, that it is a virtue that occupies a place between two vicious extremes, cowardice and temerity. But it will be a lesser evil for him who is valiant to rise till he reaches the point of rashness, than to sink until he reaches the point of cowardice. For as it is easier for the prodigal than for the miser to become generous, so it is easier for a rash man to prove truly valiant than for a coward to rise to true valor. And believe me, Señor Don Diego, in attempting adventures it is better to lose by a card too many than by a card too few. For to hear it said, such a knight is rash and daring, sounds better than such a knight is timid and cowardly. I protest, Señor Don Quixote, said Don Diego. Everything you have said and done is proved correct by the test of reason itself, and I believe if the laws and ordinances of knight-errantry should be lost, they might be found in your worship's breast as in their own proper depository and monument house. But let us make haste and reach my village, where you shall take rest after your late exertions. For if they have not been of the body, they have been of the spirit, and these sometimes tend to produce bodily fatigue. I take the invitation as a great favor and honor, Señor Don Diego, replied Don Quixote, and pressing forward at a better pace than before, at about 2 in the afternoon they reached the village and house of Don Diego, or as Don Quixote called him, the Knight of the Green Gaban.
好，呢一節讀到嚟呢一度，我個人覺得呢一節去到後段個思辨呢，又再一次比發生嘅事情呢嚟得有趣啦，嚟得有意思。前段發生咩事呢？佢哋見到迎面而嚟嘅馬車入面呢，原來係裝住咗兩隻獅子，一雌雄兩隻獅子，就係要獻俾呢個皇上嘅。咁但係呢，當叫我哋就叫停咗車夫，就同佢講：你放我出嚟，我要同呢個獅子決鬥。呢個係一個遊俠必須要做嘅，就係展現佢嘅威風，展現佢嘅膽識。咁即時 Sancho 立即就想阻止啦，包括車夫啦想阻止。而呢一個啱啱喺路上認識嘅呢個 Green 嘅班呢，佢就冇出聲嘅，因為佢已經心裏面覺得 Don Quixote 應該係傻嘅，或者佢係瘋狂嘅。 本來傾偈咧傾得好好地，以為佢都係一個有邏輯有思想嘅人，點知咧轉頭咧佢又做一啲咁瘋狂乖張嘅事，費事浪費口水啦，就只能夠喺側邊睇。當然啦，眾人就走到好遠啦，因為咧費事殃及池，放咗2隻獅子出嚟咧，真係唔係講笑。Don Quixote 就用武嚟恐嚇住呢個車夫，就放獅子出嚟。而啲獅子咧，或者周居勞動得太耐，見到 Don Quixote 着住盔甲開咗個籠面前咧，竟然冇意思出嚟，只係咧喺個籠入面就望一望，咁然之後咧就入翻去。總括嚟講係冇出過嚟嘅直情。呢個車夫咧見到 Don Quixote，仲要話：哎，你叫佢出嚟，同我決鬥，你揾支棍啦，又引佢出去啦咁。咁車夫咧就即時拒絕啦。佢話：因為咧，如果我激嬲咗咧，佢會攻擊嘅會係我，而唔係你。咁於是乎咧，我開咗個門咧，已經係真係最大嘅讓步啦。佢話：你放心啦，我一定會同皇上同所有人講有關於你嘅膽量、你嘅膽識噶啦。Don Quixote咧最尾都滿意呢個事情嘅結果啦。咁佢咧就吩咐同車夫講，就係我個名由而家開始要更改啦，我就叫做 Knight of the Lion 獅子騎士。因為咧喺佢嘅遊俠世界入面咧，呢騎士嘅名咧係經常會改嘅，就睇下佢當時嘅狀態啦，點樣。呢個車夫亦都好樂意啦嚇，幫佢去改名啦，記住呢個名啦。同埋咧，當見我哋亦都好識做喎，係都俾咗2個金幣。俾咗呢個車夫就話俾佢聽，唔好意思啦，阻你時間。咁而 Sancho 亦都好高興俾咗呢個金幣佢啦，因為當 Quixote 又吉人天相啦，原本諗住佢死緊噶啦。嚟到呢個思辨嘅位咧，就係呢個 Green 嘅班就自言自己上嚟就係話：呢個人啊真係瘋癲啊！呢個人啊神志不清啊！咁我仲以為佢係正常人添。當 Quixote 聽到咧就話：我知道我所做嘅嘢展現出嚟嘅係好瘋狂。但係我想話俾你聽，騎士都有好多種，有一啲就係留喺宮廷入面，喺皇室面前展現出佢嘅風度啊，佢嘅儀表啊，忠誠啊，對於宗教嘅熱誠啊。但亦都有一啲騎士好似我咁樣，佢係要日曬雨淋，佢係要歷險，佢係要走去最難行嘅迷宮，佢係要去突破重重嘅險阻，歷盡辛酸，展現出嚟嘅係佢嘅膽識堅毅。呢個就係我啦。呢個 Green 嘅班聽到佢咁講之後咧，佢都不免有啲遺落，某程度上都同意嘅，都覺得雖然你行事係有啲乖張啊咁，但係見到你面對住獅子毫不動容，呢個都係可觀嘅一件事。於是乎咧就邀請佢哋咧就去佢屋企度歇息一下。好，我哋睇呢字有啲咩字同大家分享，非常多字。我發現有一個字咧經常出現嘅，但係都冇同大家分享過。Yonder Y-O-N-D-E-R 係一個副詞嚟嘅 ，at some distance in the direction indicated over there， 又或者係一個 determiner 啦，或者 that or those， 又或者係一個名詞咧 the far distance。其實你係副詞 determiner 或者名詞都好咧，佢意思都係喺嗰度離遠一個地方咁樣嘅意思。Yonder 乜乜乜或者乜乜乜 yonder 離遠一個地方，遠處。Impudent 呢個常用啲啦，形容詞。impudent, impudent, not showing due respect for another person, impertinent, 放肆無禮嘅。hyperbole, hyperbole,名詞嚟嘅。exaggerated statements or claims not to be taken literally， 誇大啊，誇張啊，誇言啊，即係佢講啫，你唔好信啦，咁樣嘅意思。好，我哋呢節讀到呢度，下一節仲繼續到你聽，拜拜。